The butterfly effect explains how one seemingly small change can have a massive impact on the future. For example, leaving your house 30 seconds earlier could have unknowingly prevented you from getting into a car accident. This made me wonder what butterfly effects there have been in Fortnite, so I asked my Twitter followers what they think are the biggest what ifs in Fortnite history. After going through hundreds of replies, I chose the 4 I found most interesting to discuss in today's video. So let's get into it. What if the competitive age requirement was lowered to 13 plus? The average age of a pro in Fortnite is lower than any other esport at 16 years old. In some games like Call of Duty, you have to be 18 to compete professionally, and that causes some of the most talented players to quit or switch to other games rather than waiting. Up until February of 2019, this is exactly how it was in Fortnite, with the minimum age to compete being 16 years old. Although at the time, most of the game's best players were older than 16, there were a lot of talented young players. Most tournaments like the Fall and Summer Skirmish were invite only, so Epic didn't really have to worry about underage players competing since they chose them. This was until Winter Royale in 2018, which was the first completely open tournament. Out of the 200 players that qualified on EU, 28 of them were not old enough to participate. You will recognize a lot of big names on this list like Mongrel, Benji Fishy, and Mr. Savage. Obviously, they went on to be some of the best players of all time, but this might not have happened if they had to miss out on the $30 million Fortnite World Cup. Imagine knowing you are so good that you are guaranteed to make at least $50,000, but being forced to miss out because of your age. Out of the 100 players that qualified for the Solo World Cup, 32 of them were under 16, so they would not have been able to compete if it wasn't for the rule change. You might be thinking, well, those 32 spots would have just gone to the next best players that were eligible, but that is not the case. If these players weren't allowed in the lobbies in the first place, every single game in the history of Fortnite competitive would be different. Even today, some of the best tier 1 pros are not even 16 years old. I could sit here all day and list specific players, but the best example is Power Alex. Alex is an Australian player with 3 FNCS titles, and right now he is only 15 years old. He played his first tournament when he was only 10 and placed 3rd in FNCS when he was 12. With over $100,000 in earnings, it's crazy to think that he would still not be able to play tournaments if the rule was never changed. And duos like Peterbot and Poyo would have never been able to dominate the game like they have because Poyo just recently turned 16. Overall, I think the game would be a lot easier if you had to be 16 to compete. The younger players are the ones who are constantly pushing the mechanical skill level higher and higher, and when you think of the best fighters in the game, you do not think of an old person. It makes you wonder if an old head like Tfue would have multiple FNCS wins and be considered the GOAT of Fortnite. At the end of the day, I think only needing to be 13 years old is one of the main reasons Fortnite still thrives as an esport, and it was a great change. But it makes you wonder how different things would be if this didn't change. Another player who wouldn't have been able to compete until last year was the FNCS Global Champion, Cooper. So what if Cooper didn't win the coin flip that changed his life? In March of 2023, Mero, who at the time had 5 FNCS wins, announced that he was retiring from Fortnite. After a couple weeks, he realized that he wanted to keep playing, but didn't want to take the game as seriously as before. Because of this, he decided to play with somebody he enjoyed playing with rather than the best player he could find. Eventually, he narrowed it down to 2 players, Cooper and Crisp, but he just could not choose which one to play with. In order to decide, he sent Cooper this DM asking him to choose heads or tails, and he picked tails. As we all know, Cooper guessed correctly, and from there, him and Mero went on to dominate. In Chapter 4 Season 2, they placed 2nd in their first FNCS together, winning $95,000 and securing their spot at the Global Championships in Copenhagen. 5 months later, they went on to win the biggest land since World Cup, securing $1 million and winning Mero's 6th FNCS title. But what if Cooper lost this coin flip? As we know, if he chose incorrectly, Mero would have duoed with Crisp. If you don't know who Crisp is, he is a very talented player with his best FNCS placement being 6th. In Chapter 4 Season 1, he came just short of qualifying for Grand Finals, so he was looking for a duo. Him and Mero would have played, but since he was playing with Cooper, Crisp had to find someone else. The next 2 seasons, he would place 38th and 28th in FNCS, which was not too good. Luckily, there was a last chance qualifier, so he had one more shot to qualify for Copenhagen. He teamed up with Noxy for this, and they finished in 6th, securing their spot, but the actual tournament wouldn't go too well as they finished in 25th place. So would Crisp and Mero have performed as well as Mero did with Cooper? Well, they actually did play one tournament together in Chapter 4 Season 2. It was a duo cash cup and they placed 2nd, so even with no practice together, they were already really good. Looking at this, it's surprising that Mero didn't play with him. Obviously, it's hard to say that they could have done better considering they would have had to outdo a 2nd in FNCS and win globals, but it was definitely possible. The thing is, this story goes a little deeper. Everybody knows someone who says if I had 0 ping, I'd be the best player in the game, and Cooper was one of those people. Living Living in Texas his whole life, he was always a 50 ping player, which is not ideal, but when NA East and NA West merged to NA Central, he became 0 ping overnight. When this happened, he only had $8,000 earned, but he was ready to put all of his time and energy into Fortnite. This would obviously pay off, but if the servers never combined, Mero wouldn't even have considered playing with him, and things would be a lot different. Another duo probably would have won globals, and all three of these players would have drastically different careers. It's crazy how a coin flip and a seemingly insignificant change completely altered Cooper's life in 6 months. The only reason Mero gave him a chance in the first place is because of his insane mechanics, so that makes me wonder, what if turbo building was never added? Most people watching this video probably didn't even play Fortnite without turbo building, but if you did, you know it was a completely different game. Up until Chapter 1 Season 3, you had to click every time you wanted to place a build rather than just holding down a button. Obviously, this made building way harder, which is one of the reasons everybody was so bad. As soon as they added it in February of 2018, every single person who played Fortnite got 10 times better. Without this change, players would only be able to get so good before it was impossible to improve anymore, but turbo building unlocked new potential for how far the mechanics of the game could be pushed. It's crazy to think that at the end of Chapter 1, triple editing was considered impressive, and we already thought that was close to the best anybody could get. Fast forward 5 years and players are still getting better, pushing the boundaries way past what anybody could have ever predicted. So what if it was never added? Well, we did get a glimpse of the game without it during Season X. In August of 2019, Epic changed the time between turbo build placements from 0.005 seconds to 0.15 seconds. They made this change to make ping less of a factor and make it harder to play defensively, but it just felt terrible. After developing the muscle memory for so long, then suddenly relearning everything but being worse no matter what was not fun. The game would have just got really boring really fast because there was no way to improve past a certain point. Thankfully, it was only in the game for 24 hours because nobody liked it. I do think that the older, less mechanical players like Chap would have stayed at the top of the professional scene because it would have been easier to keep up with everybody else's improvement. But the thing is, even if turbo building wasn't added, players would have just forced it to be a thing. What I mean by this is players would have eventually found ways to mimic turbo building. For example, XBeaks made a video where he used his scroll wheel to place as many builds as fast as possible. This eventually would have been adopted by the competitive players, and even if they didn't use their scroll wheel, they could have just set up a macro to do the same thing. Although it's bannable, it would have happened regardless. Overall, I do think the addition of turbo building was great because it made it one of the most mechanically challenging games of all time. 7 years after its release, the realm of what's possible when it comes to building and editing is still advancing, and Fortnite would be very different and probably boring if everybody was capped at the same skill level. Another big thing when it comes to skill is having good aim. At one point, every controller player basically had aimbot, so what if aim assist never got nerfed? In the first couple years of Fortnite being out, controller was a way worse input than keyboard and mouse, and nobody would disagree with that. But this started to change once controller players discovered L2 spamming. L2 spamming was basically aimbot because every time you'd aim down sights, your crosshair would snap onto the player due to the aim assist. Over time, everybody would get better and better with it, but the real jump in skill came at the beginning of Chapter 2. Most players used the legacy aim settings, which made L2 spamming work, but eventually it was removed because it was too good. The thing is, the new linear aim settings were even better. It basically went from everybody on controller having aimbot while aiming down sights to everybody having aimbot while hip firing. Because of this, the best way to fight was to do whatever it took to get into a box and 50-50, but since it was so easy to aim, it wasn't really a 50-50. Before linear settings were added, the most controller players you'd ever see in a major tournament final was around 10 to 15. But in Chapter 2 Season 2, this number was anywhere between 45 to 65 depending on the region. Based on the numbers, you're probably thinking that controller and keyboard were finally balanced, but that was not the case. For the first time ever, controller was the superior input, and it was far too broken and definitely needed a nerf. I mean, just watching the clips, you can see that aim assist had no business being as good as it was. When Chapter 2 Season 3 came out, they finally gave it a much needed nerf, and after this, the controller players who were genuinely talented kept placing well, but the rest of them became really bad. So what if aim assist was the same today as it was back then? Well, to start, I think we would see more top tier controller players, but it wouldn't be as many as you think. If you compare the mechanical ability of the average competitive player in Chapter 2 to the average player today, there is obviously a massive difference. The big advantage controller players had back then is that the mechanical skill level was nowhere close to what it is now, so it was really easy to get into a box. I think controller would have been really broken up until the middle of Chapter 3, but around that time most players were really skilled and knew how to keep someone out of their box. Although even today they would still have a huge advantage in endgames where sometimes you can't avoid taking a 50-50, and if somebody had literal aimbot, it'd be hard to win. Like I said, there was a point where over half of the players in a finals lobby would be controller, but in the last 2 years the most to qualify for any FNCS Grands is 20. Also, out of the 100 players that qualified for this year's Global Championships, only 6 play controller. Overall, if aim assist wasn't nerfed, I think controller would have absolutely dominated the rest of Chapter 2, but once everybody got good enough and learned how to counter the playstyle, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. Today, keyboard and mouse is just the better input because of how advanced the game has gotten, and that's the main reason it dominates the top of the competitive scene. Let me know your thoughts on these topics in the comments because I think it's really interesting to think about how different Fortnite and the competitive scene could be. Also, be sure to drop a like and subscribe because I upload once or twice a week if I'm not lazy.